February 17, 2009, federal agents arrested Robert Allen Stanford outside his girlfriend's home in Fredericksburg, Virginia. The SEC had just filed civil fraud charges alleging Stanford orchestrated a $7 billion Ponzi scheme through his offshore bank in Antigua. Over 30,000 investors across 113 countries faced total losses. The collapse marked one of the largest financial frauds in history, second only to Bernie Madoff's scheme exposed just 2 months earlier. This is the story of how a Texas entrepreneur built a Caribbean banking empire on fraudulent certificates of deposit, maintained the illusion through fabricated returns for 2 decades, and collapsed only when the 2008 financial crisis made continued deception impossible. Allen Stanford did not start as a financier. Born in 1950 in Mexia, Texas, he worked in real estate and health clubs during the 1970s and 1980s. According to court documents, Stanford filed for bankruptcy in 1987 after failed business ventures. The transformation began in 1985 when Stanford purchased Guardian International, a small financial services company in Montserrat. In 1986, he relocated operations to Antigua and renamed it Stanford International Bank. The choice of Antigua was strategic. The island offered bank licenses with minimal scrutiny. According to subsequent investigations, Stanford obtained his license through political connections rather than regulatory review. The bank marketed certificates of deposit promising returns significantly above U.S. rates. When American banks offered 3 to 5%, Stanford promoted rates of 7 to 11%. The superior returns supposedly came from sophisticated investment strategies managed by expert advisors. The pitch appealed to wealthy Latin Americans seeking secure offshore accounts, American retirees wanting higher income, and regional banks depositing reserves, according to court filings. Stanford's sales force targeted these groups through network marketing and referral incentives. Stanford built credibility through conspicuous displays of wealth. He purchased a $10 million Miami estate, acquired Caribbean mansions, bought cricket teams, and financed tournaments. According to financial disclosures, Stanford contributed over $5 million to U.S. political candidates between 2000 and 2008. In 2006, Antigua awarded Stanford a knighthood for economic contributions. Marketing materials thereafter referred to him as Sir Allen Stanford. The title conveyed legitimacy. By 2008, Stanford Financial Group employed over 1,000 people across offices in Houston, Miami, Caracas, Bogota, and dozens of other cities, according to marketing presentations. The company managed over $50 billion in client assets. The core product remained certificates of deposit. According to SEC filings, the bank sold approximately $7 billion in CDs by 2008. Clients received official certificates with interest rates, maturity dates, and terms. Investors received regular interest payments. Early redemptions were processed smoothly, reinforcing confidence. Stanford cultivated relationships with financial advisors who earn commissions ranging from 3 to 6% on CD sales, significantly higher than traditional products. According to court documents, many advisors built entire practices around Stanford products. Marketing materials emphasized safety and consistency. Historical returns showed 10 to 15% annually over 2 decades, positive even during market downturns. Financial statements reinforced soundness. According to published reports audited by chartered accountants of Antigua and Barbuda, the bank maintained strong capital ratios and growing assets. The balance sheet listed billions in securities, real estate, and loan portfolios, but the entire structure was fraudulent. According to court findings, Stanford operated a classic Ponzi scheme. New investor deposits funded interest payments to existing investors and financed Stanford's personal expenses. The investment portfolio described in statements did not exist in the forms claimed. Warning signs existed for sophisticated observers. The consistency of returns defied market reality. No legitimate strategy delivers 10 to 15% annually without volatility. The auditor was a tiny firm with limited resources, according to subsequent revelations. It consisted of a single accountant operating from a small office. Stanford International Bank operated under Antiguan supervision, not U.S. federal oversight, creating regulatory blind spots. Some financial advisors questioned the claims, according to testimony. Several requested detailed portfolio information. Stanford's responses were vague. Citing proprietary strategies, Venezuelan banking regulators raised concerns in the mid-2000s. According to court documents, Stanford responded by ceasing Venezuelan operations. The investigation did not lead to broader enforcement. By 2008, Stanford's empire appeared thriving. Forbes estimated his wealth exceeded $2 billion. His Stanford 2020's cricket tournament featured a $20 million prize. But beneath the success, the scheme was becoming unsustainable. The 2008 financial crisis triggered massive redemption requests. According to regulatory findings, redemption requests in late 2008 exceeded Stanford's available cash by hundreds of millions. Stanford could not meet redemptions without collapsing the scheme. The supposed investment portfolio generating returns did not exist. The core fraud was simple. Stanford International Bank collected approximately $7 billion by selling certificates of deposit promising 7 to 11% returns. The bank claimed deposits were invested in diversified portfolios managed by sophisticated advisors, according to court findings. This was completely false. The investment portfolio did not exist. Stanford operated a textbook Ponzi scheme. New investor deposits funded interest payments to existing investors and financed Stanford's personal expenses, including real estate, private jets, yachts, and cricket sponsorships. No legitimate investment activity generated the promised returns. The operation depended on continuous new money inflows. When an investor purchased a $1 million CD, the money transferred to Stanford's Antigua accounts. According to representations, professional managers would invest these funds. In reality, Stanford used funds to pay earlier investors, cover expenses, and finance his lifestyle. Financial statements were fabricated. According to court documents, Chief Financial Officer James Davis created false records showing billions in investment holdings. Statements listed portfolios of Treasury securities, corporate bonds, real estate, and private equity. But investigators determined the vast majority either did not exist or were worthless. According to SEC Forensic Accounting, approximately $2 billion of $7 billion collected was spent on Stanford's personal expenses. Another $1.6 billion funded interest payments, the classic Ponzi mechanism. Operating costs consumed over $1 billion. Remaining funds were dissipated through loans to Stanford entities that never repaid. Stanford maintained deception through complete information control. Unlike legitimate banks subject to independent audits, Stanford operated under minimal oversight. The Antiguan regulator conducted limited reviews and lacked resources to verify holdings. According to investigations, Stanford's relationship with regulators was collaborative rather than adversarial. He was the island's largest private employer and major political donor. The bank's auditor, C.S. Hewlett, provided legitimacy without substance. According to court testimony, Hewlett was a one-person firm operating from a small Antigua office. Annual audits were performed without verifying securities or conducting independent valuations. Hewlett relied entirely on Stanford staff information. Chief Financial Officer James Davis was central to maintaining fraud. Davis had known Stanford since childhood. According to his later testimony, Davis joined operations in the 1980s and gradually realized the business was fraudulent. But Davis continued participating for over 2 decades, creating false statements and lying to investors. Davis ultimately pleaded guilty and cooperated with prosecutors. According to SEC findings, actual holdings bore no resemblance to descriptions. Stanford held large positions in illiquid private companies he controlled, Caribbean real estate with questionable valuations, and ventures including restaurants and airlines that consistently lost money. These could not be converted to cash or produce promised returns. The liquidity mismatch created constant pressure. According to forensic analysis, the bank frequently held less than $100 million in liquid assets while owing over $7 billion to depositors. Any significant redemption wave would immediately expose fraud. Stanford managed liquidity through aggressive sales. Financial advisors were incentivized to generate new deposits continuously. Traditional bank CDs offered advisors 0.5% commissions. Stanford paid 3 to 6%. According to court documents, some advisors generated over $1 million annually from Stanford commissions alone. Many advisors believed returns were legitimate. They saw consistent payments. Observed Stanford's wealth. Noted his knighthood. Some conducted due diligence but relied on audited statements and licenses. That appeared legitimate, but red flags should have triggered scrutiny. The consistency of returns was the most obvious warning, according to Stanford's data. The bank delivered positive returns every single year for 2 decades, including 2001-2002 dot-com crash and 2008 crisis. No legitimate diversified portfolio achieves that consistency. The auditor problem was another clear signal. Major institutions use internationally recognized firms. Stanford used a one-person Antigua firm. Any competent advisor should have questioned this. The SEC received warnings as early as 1997, according to agency records. A private analyst alleged Stanford operated a Ponzi scheme. The SEC's Fort Worth office investigated but closed without action. Additional complaints reached the SEC through 2009. According to Inspector General reports, the agency received at least 8 substantive complaints. Each time, investigations closed without charges. The jurisdictional question was complex. Stanford held an Antiguan license and did not directly solicit U.S. investors. Independent advisors recommended Stanford CDs. This created ambiguity about SEC authority. The agency's lawyers debated these questions for years while fraud continued. Meanwhile, Stanford's political connections provided protection. According to campaign records, Stanford contributed heavily to both parties. He gained access to powerful senators on banking committees. According to lobbying disclosure forms, Stanford Financial spent over $5 million on political influence between 2004 and 2008. By late 2008, the scheme was collapsing. The financial crisis triggered massive redemption requests, according to SEC filings. Fourth quarter 2008 redemptions exceeded $1 billion. Stanford lacked liquid assets to honor requests. On February 16, 2009, the SEC filed civil fraud charges. The complaint alleged Stanford orchestrated a massive Ponzi scheme, stealing approximately $7 billion from over 30,000 investors. Federal agents arrested Stanford the following day. The receiver's investigation revealed devastating losses. According to court filings, Stanford International Bank owed approximately $7 billion but held less than $1 billion in recoverable assets. The shortfall exceeded $6 billion. Over 30,000 investors across 113 countries faced catastrophic losses. Many were retirees who invested entire life savings. Small banks in Latin America and Caribbean had placed depositor funds in Stanford CDs, creating secondary victims. Approximately 18,000 investors were in Latin America, primarily Venezuela, Mexico, Colombia, and Ecuador. Another 6,000 were in the United States, concentrated in Texas, Florida, and Louisiana. Stanford initially maintained innocence. According to early court appearances, he claimed SEC allegations were false and businesses were legitimate. He argued temporary liquidity problems from the financial crisis had been mischaracterized as fraud. Federal prosecutors rejected these claims. On June 18, 2009, a federal grand jury indicted Stanford on 21 criminal counts, including wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction. According to the indictment, Stanford knowingly operated a Ponzi scheme and made false statements to investors and regulators. If convicted on all counts, Stanford faced over 200 years in prison. The trial faced unusual delays. In January 2011, Stanford was injured in a jailhouse assault. According to medical evaluations, he suffered head trauma and developed medication addiction. Defense attorneys argued Stanford was incompetent to stand trial. The competency dispute delayed proceedings over a year. In January 2012, the judge ruled Stanford competent. Trial began in Houston federal court. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence. According to testimony, James Davis described how he and Stanford created false financial statements for 2 decades. Davis explained the Ponzi mechanics, fabricated portfolio, and Stanford's personal use of funds. Prosecution introduced Stanford's bank records showing hundreds of millions transferred to personal accounts. According to evidence, Stanford spent investor money on private jets, yachts, mansions, and failed ventures. Forensic accountants testified about the absence of legitimate investments. Stanford's defense attempted to argue he genuinely believed investments would prove profitable. According to defense attorneys, Stanford was overly optimistic but did not intentionally defraud. Defense portrayed Stanford as a visionary entrepreneur derailed by the 2008 crisis. The jury deliberated approximately 4 days. On March 6, 2012, they returned guilty verdicts on 13 of 14 counts, according to post-trial interviews. Jurors found evidence of intentional fraud overwhelming. On June 14, 2012, the judge sentenced Stanford to 110 years in federal prison. According to the sentencing memorandum, the court considered the massive scale, number of victims, Stanford's lack of remorse, and obstruction attempts. The judge ordered Stanford to forfeit $5.9 billion. Though prosecutors acknowledged recovery was impossible, Stanford was 62 years old, making the 110-year sentence effectively life. Stanford appealed on multiple grounds. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals reviewed extensively. In January 2014, the appeals court affirmed conviction and sentence, ruling the trial was fair and evidence overwhelming. The civil recovery process proved frustratingly slow. Court-appointed receiver Ralph Janvey worked to identify and liquidate assets. According to receiver reports, the process was extraordinarily complex. Stanford had dispersed funds across dozens of entities in multiple countries. Many assets were in Caribbean jurisdictions with limited cooperation. Real estate had questionable titles. By 2024, the receiver had recovered approximately $500 million for distribution, less than 8% of the $7 billion owed. Recovery came from selling properties, clawing back funds from early investors, and settling lawsuits against parties who facilitated fraud. The SEC faced intense criticism for failing to stop Stanford despite repeated warnings. The Inspector General issued a scathing 2010 report examining SEC handling between 1997 and 2009. According to the report, Fort Worth office received multiple substantive complaints. Examiners identified red flags including impossible returns, questionable auditor, and offshore structure. Yet the agency failed to act for over a decade, according to findings. SEC attorneys disagreed about jurisdictional authority. Some argued Stanford fell outside SEC purview. Others believed the agency had clear authority but lacked political support. Internal debates consumed years while fraud continued. The Madoff scandal, exposed 2 months before Stanford's arrest, had already damaged SEC credibility. Back-to-back revelations triggered calls for agency reform. Congressional hearings examined systemic problems including inadequate funding, poor coordination, and regulatory capture. Legislative responses included enhanced SEC enforcement funding and new investment advisor registration requirements. The Dodd-Frank Act included provisions strengthening SEC authority. According to proponents, these reforms would prevent future Stanfords and Madoffs. The case exposed offshore banking regulatory gaps. Stanford exploited Antigua's weak framework and absence of effective international information sharing. The case prompted international efforts to strengthen cross-border cooperation. Stanford's fraud ultimately cost investors over $6 billion in actual losses. The scheme operated approximately 20 years. Over 30,000 investors across 100-plus countries suffered losses. Stanford received a 110-year sentence. Victims recovered less than 8%. If you found this investigation valuable, consider subscribing for more examinations of financial fraud and systemic vulnerabilities that enable it.